The 13th lash split the morning air like thunder, and with it, Ezekiel Washington's world exploded into white-hot agony. His fingers clawed at the blood-soaked earth beneath the ancient oak tree, nails scraping against roots that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The leather whip cracked again, 14, and he felt his flesh part like water, warm blood streaming down his back to feed the thirsty ground below. "Count them, boy." Overseer Cornelius Blackthorn's voice boomed across the plantation's punishment ground, his words dripping with sadistic pleasure. "Let every nigger on this plantation hear you count your sins." Ezekiel's voice came out as a broken whisper, barely audible above the rustling of the oak's massive canopy overhead. 14. The word tasted of copper and despair, bound to iron rings that had been driven deep into the oak's trunk decades ago. His younger brother Josiah hung limp against the scarred bark, his own back a canvas of fresh wounds from the first half of his punishment. Blood had already begun to seep into the tree's crevices, following paths carved by countless victims before them. The oak seemed to drink it eagerly, its ancient wood darkening where the crimson touched. Above them, the tree's branches swayed despite the absence of any wind. 200 years this sentinel had stood guard over Bourbon County, its gnarled limbs reaching toward heaven like the arms of the damned. Cherokee hands had planted it in soil that had known peace, but decades of suffering had corrupted its very essence. Now its bark bore the carved initials of the dead, names etched by trembling fingers in final moments, a testament to all who had perished in its shadow. The 15th lash came down with renewed fury, and Ezekiel's scream pierced the September morning. As his cry echoed across the fields where other enslaved souls toiled under the merciless sun, something stirred beneath the earth. The oak's roots, black with absorbed blood and decades of torment, seemed to shift and writhe like serpents. In the depths, "You boys thought you could run," Blackthorn snarled, his pale face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Thought you could steal away in the night like the ungrateful animals you are. Well, this tree's going to teach you different things." Thaddeus Pike, a wiry man with yellowed teeth and cruel eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice at the base of the oak. 25 lashes each ought to cure 'em of their wandering thoughts, Cornelius. Maybe next time they'll think twice before trying to follow that underground railroad nonsense. Mordecai Crane, built like a bull with hands the size of dinner. Plates laughed, a sound like grinding millstones. "Hell, Pike, I say we make it 30. These Washington boys have been nothing but trouble since the day they arrived." Standing in the shade of the oak's lower branches, Silas Grimm nodded his agreement. His pale, almost translucent skin marked him as a man who preferred the shadows, and his small, dark eyes never seemed to blink. "The tree's seen worse than this, ain't you, old girl?" He patted the oak's trunk affectionately, his fingers tracing the deep grooves in its bark. "She's got stories to tell, this one does. Stories that'd turn your hair white." Augustus Fell, the youngest of the overseers at barely 25, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Unlike the others, he seemed troubled by the proceedings, his gaze darting nervously between the bleeding brothers and the ominous canopy above. Maybe you should shut your mouth, boy," Blackthorn cut him off. "This is how we maintain order. This is how we keep our property in line." The 16th lash fell, and with it came something else, a whisper, soft as silk, that seemed to emanate from the very wood of the oak itself. Only Ezekiel heard it, a voice like rustling leaves that spoke directly into his mind. "Soon, child. Soon the debt will be paid." His head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. The pain in his back suddenly seemed distant, replaced by a cold certainty that something ancient and terrible was stirring to life around them. The oak's hollow trunk, large enough to hide a grown man, echoed with phantom screams, the voices of all who had died here, all whose blood had seeped into its roots over the decades. Josiah's head lolled to one side, his consciousness wavering between agony and darkness. Blood from his wounds had formed strange patterns on the oak's bark, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The tree's sap, normally clear and golden, had turned black where it mixed with their blood, creating dark veins that pulsed like arteries through the ancient wood. "Look at that," Pike observed with scientific curiosity. pointing to where Josiah's blood had begun to foam and bubble against the bark. Never seen the tree do that before. Almost like it's alive. Grim's laugh was cold and humorless. Everything's alive if you know how to look at it, Pike. This old oak's been drinking blood for longer than any of us have been breathing. Cherokee used to say it was cursed, back before we cleared him out. The 17th lash struck, and Ezekiel felt something crack inside him. Not bone or flesh, but something deeper. The whisper came again, stronger this time. We have been waiting. So long have we been waiting. He tried to speak, to warn the overseers of the darkness gathering around them, but only blood came from his lips. Above them, the oak's branches had begun to sway more violently, creating a sound like distant thunder. Leaves, though it was still weeks before they should fall, began to drop like tears onto the bloody ground below. Blackthorn raised his arm for the 18th strike, but paused as a shadow fell across them all. The sun had been shining brightly moments before, yet now the sky above the oak seemed darker, as if storm clouds had gathered from nowhere. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with electricity that made the hair on every man's arm stand on, and, strange weather for September, Fell muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring up at the oak's canopy with growing unease, noting how the branches seemed to be reaching downward, as if trying to embrace the scene below. Weather's got nothing to do with it, Grim said softly, his pale eyes reflecting a knowledge that the others lacked. The tree's waking up, I can feel it in my bones. Crane spat into the dirt, his brutish features twisted with contempt. You and your superstitions, Grim. It's just a damn tree. But even as he spoke, the massive oak's trunk began to emit a low, almost inaudible hum, a sound felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground and into the bones of every man present. The carved initials on its bark seemed to glow faintly in the strange twilight that had fallen over the punishment ground. The 18th lash fell with mechanical precision, but Blackthorn's confidence was beginning to waver. The whip felt heavier in his hands, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the sudden chill in the air. Just 7 more, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. 7 more and we'll be done with this business. But Ezekiel knew they would never be done. As his blood continued to flow into the hungry earth, he felt his consciousness expanding, touching something vast and patient that had been sleeping beneath the oak for decades. The tree had been collecting the pain, the suffering, the dying breath of every soul that had perished in its shadow, storing it like nectar in its blackened heartwood. Now it was ready to spend that accumulated agony. 5 men must hang. The whisper came again, and this time Josiah heard it too. His eyes snapped open, meeting his brother's gaze with sudden understanding. 5 men to balance the scales. 5 men to feed the roots that have grown fat on innocent blood. The 19th lash struck, but the pain was different now, cleaner, sharper, as if it were cutting away everything weak and human from Ezekiel's spirit. He felt himself changing, becoming something harder and more terrible than mere flesh and bone. Pike shifted nervously, his earlier bravado evaporating as he watched the dark stains spreading across the oak's trunk. Cornelius, maybe we should finish this inside. Sky's looking mighty queer. But Blackthorn was lost in his work now, drunk on power and the rhythmic crack of leather against flesh. 20, 21, 22. With each strike, the oak's whispers grew stronger and the brothers felt their transformation accelerating. The very air around the tree had begun to shimmer like heat waves, though the temperature continued to drop. Augustus backed away from the trunk, his young face pale with instinctive terror. Something ain't right here, boys. Something ain't right at all. 23. 24. And with the 25th and final lash, something fundamental shifted in the world around the ancient oak. The whispers became a roar, the shadows deepened to absolute blackness, and for just a moment, every man present saw the truth, saw the oak as it really was, a living monument to suffering, its branches heavy with the ghosts of the hanged. Then, the moment passed and normal daylight returned. The overseer stood blinking in confusion, unsure what they had seen or felt. But the Washington brothers knew. As Blackthorn untied their bonds and they collapsed to the blood-soaked earth, they understood that they had been chosen for something greater and more terrible than simple revenge. The oak's roots pulsed beneath them, and in that rhythm they heard the beating of an ancient heart that had finally awakened from its long slumber. "Get these boys back to the quarters," Blackthorn ordered, coiling his whip with shaking hands, "and clean this mess up. I don't want to see another drop of blood on my tree." But blood had already seeped too deep into the oak's roots to ever be washed away. As the brothers were dragged away by other enslaved workers, they heard the tree's final whisper of the day, a promise that would haunt their dreams and fuel their transformation. "Soon, children, very soon the harvest will begin." The 5 overseers walked away from the punishment ground, unaware that they had just sealed their own fates. Behind them, the ancient oak stood silent once more, its branches swaying gently in a breeze that touched nothing else on earth. But deep in its heartwood, something dark and patient began to plan, counting the days until justice could finally be served. The 13th lash had awakened more than pain. It had awakened a hunger that would not be satisfied until 5 men, swung from the very branches they had used to inflict such cruelty, and in the hollow of the oak's trunk, carved deep in the blackened wood, new initials began to appear as if etched by invisible hands. CBTPMCSGAF, the names of the condemned. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments below. Which overseer do you think will be the first to meet their fate beneath the cursed oak? Will it be cruel Cornelius Blackthorn, sadistic Thaddeus Pike, brutish Mordecai Crane, sinister Silas Grimm, or the conflicted young Augustus Fell? Share your predictions and theories about what supernatural horrors await these men. The dreams came to Ezekiel Washington in the darkest hour before dawn. When the veil between worlds grew thin as morning mist, he lay on his belly in the cramped slave quarters, his back still raw with wounds that refused to heal properly, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the floorboards like groundwater. "Come to us, child. Come and learn your true purpose." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something far more ancient than human vocal cords could produce. It was the sound of wind through leaves, of roots growing deep in rich earth, of time itself grinding forward with inexorable patience. Beside him on the rough straw pallet, Josiah stirred in his sleep, his breathing labored and uneven. Fresh blood had soaked through the crude bandages that covered his wounds, staining the thin blanket they shared. But even in his fevered state, his lips moved silently, mouthing words in a language neither brother had ever learned. "Cherokee, words," came the whisper, answering Ezekiel's unspoken question. "The first tongue spoken beneath our branches, the language of those who knew us before the corruption began." Ezekiel's eyes snapped open, searching the darkness of the quarters. 20 other souls slept around them in various states of exhaustion and despair, but none stirred. The voice was meant for him alone, a secret communication that bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to something deeper than consciousness. "Rise, Ezekiel Washington. Rise and come to us. There are things you must understand before the work begins." Against every instinct of self-preservation, Ezekiel found himself sitting up, then standing. His back screamed in protest, fresh blood seeping from wounds that had cracked open with the movement. But the compulsion was too strong to resist. His feet, bare and silent on the wooden floor, carried him toward the door of the quarters. The night air was unseasonably cold for September in Kentucky, and thick fog had rolled in from the Kentucky River, blanketing the plantation in ghostly, white silence. Through the mist, the ancient oak stood like a monument to suffering, its massive trunk barely visible 30 yards away. But Ezekiel could feel it calling to him, a magnetic pull that drew him across the wet grass toward the punishment ground. As he approached, the fog seemed to part around the tree, revealing details that had been hidden in daylight. The bark was not merely scarred with carved initials, it was covered in them, layer upon layer of names and messages scratched by desperate fingers over the decades. Some were fresh and sharp, others had been worn smooth by time and weather, but all told the same story of lives cut short beneath these branches. The hollow in the trunk, which appeared no larger than a man's torso during the day, now yawned open like a mouth, easily wide enough to step inside. From its depths came a faint phosphorescent glow, green as marsh fire and twice as unsettling. Enter, child. Enter, and see what we have become. Ezekiel's feet moved of their own accord, carrying him to the threshold of the hollow. The moment he stepped inside, the world transformed around him. The interior of the oak was vast, impossibly vast, stretching up into darkness that seemed to have no ceiling, and down into roots that descended like cathedral arches into the earth. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that resembled both nerve pathways and river deltas, carrying some vital essence through the living wood, and everywhere, suspended in the glowing amber of the tree's sap, were faces. Hundreds of them. Thousands. The preserved visages of every soul who had died beneath the oak's branches, their expressions frozen in their final moments. Some showed peace, others terror, but all bore witness to the tree's long history as keeper of the dead. "We are the memory of this place," the voices said. And now Ezekiel could hear that it was not one voice but a chorus. Every soul the oak had claimed, speaking in perfect unison. Cherokee warriors hung here when the white settlers came, runaway slaves caught by the patrollers, poor whites who crossed the wrong plantation owner, abolitionists who spoke too loudly of freedom. We are all here, child, waiting for justice to finally come. At the center of the vast hollow, rising from the earth like an altar, grew something that made Ezekiel's breath catch in his throat. It was a tree within the tree, a sapling of pure black wood, no taller than a man, with branches that moved like living serpents despite the absence of any wind. Its leaves were the deep red of fresh blood, and from its bark seeped a substance that was neither sap nor resin but something far more viscous and dark. The heart of vengeance, the voices explained, grown from soil nourished by innocent blood, watered with the tears of the suffering, pruned by the prayers of the dying. It has taken us 87 years to grow it to maturity, and now it is ready to bear its fruit. Ezekiel approached the black sapling on trembling legs. As he drew near, its branches reached out to him, not with menace, but with something almost like tenderness. When the dark wood touched his skin, visions flooded his mind. Not his own memories, but the accumulated experiences of every soul that had ever died beneath the great oak. He saw Cherokee Chief Running Bear, strung up in 1770 for refusing to cede his tribe's sacred burial ground to white settlers. He felt the man's dignity even in death, his final prayer that the land itself would one day rise up against those who defiled it. He witnessed the hanging of Mercy Goodwin in 1803, a Quaker woman who had been caught smuggling slaves to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Her last words had been a prophecy. This tree will remember, and in remembering it will judge. He experienced the terror of young Marcus Freeman in 1834, barely 16 years old, lynched for the crime of learning to read. The boy's final thoughts had been of books he would never finish, words he would never write, dreams that would die with him beneath these cursed branches. Dozens more followed. Samuel Cross, Rebecca White, Isaiah Thompson, each death adding to the oak's growing reservoir of injustice and pain. With each vision, Ezekiel felt something within himself changing, hardening, becoming less human and more like an instrument of divine retribution. Do you understand now, child? Do you see why you and your brother have been chosen? Chosen for what? Ezekiel whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast hollow. The black sapling's branches caressed his face, leaving trails of cool dampness on his cheeks. To be our hands in the world of flesh, to carry out the judgment that has been too long delayed. 5 men have used our trunk as their post for cruelty. 5 men have watered our roots with innocent blood. 5 men must hang before the balance can be restored. Images flashed through Ezekiel's mind. Cornelius Blackthorne, Thaddeus Pike, Mordecai Crane, Silas Grimm, and Augustus Fell. But now he saw them not as they appeared to the world, but as they truly were beneath their human facades. Blackthorne was a creature of pure sadism, his soul black with accumulated cruelty. Pike was a coward who used violence to mask his own terror. Crane was simple brutality given human form, while Grim carried shadows that suggested knowledge of dark things better left alone. Only Augustus Fell showed any flicker of something redeemable, a conscience that still struggled against the corruption around him. But even that spark was growing dimmer with each passing day, snuffed out by the casual evil of plantation life. All 5 must hang, the voices insisted. The young one's potential for redemption makes his fall all the more necessary. Evil that chooses itself is far worse than evil born of ignorance. Ezekiel wanted to protest, to argue that surely there was another way, but the visions had shown him too much. He had felt the dying breaths of too many innocents, experienced their final moments of agony and despair. Justice demanded payment, and payment would be extracted. How? He asked simply. The black sapling pulsed with dark light, and its voice became warmer, almost paternal. Through you and your brother, we will reach into the world of flesh. Your blood has mingled with our roots, creating a connection that cannot be broken. When the time comes, you will know what to do. Our power will flow through you, and our hunger will become your own. Are we to be executioners then? Murderers? You will be justice incarnate. The distinction between murder and righteous judgment is written in the intentions of the heart. We have waited nearly a century for this moment, child. We will not be denied now that the final harvest is at hand. The visions began to fade, and Ezekiel felt himself being gently pushed back toward the entrance of the hollow. But as he reached the threshold, the voices called to him one final time. Tell your brother what you have seen. Prepare him for what is to come. And watch for the signs. They have already begun. The hollow's entrance contracted behind him, returning to its normal size, and the phosphorescent glow faded to nothing. Ezekiel stood in the fog-shrouded night, shivering not from cold, but from the magnitude of what he had experienced. When he looked up at the oak's branches, he could see them differently now, not as mere wood and leaf, but as the arms of something vast and patient that was finally ready to move. He turned to walk back to the quarters, but movement in an upstairs window of the plantation house caught his eye. A figure stood silhouetted against the lamplight, Overseer Thaddeus Pike, staring directly at him across the fog-shrouded grounds. Even at this distance, Ezekiel could see that Pike's hands were pressed to his throat and that his mouth was open in what might have been a scream. The overseer stood frozen at the window for several long moments before stumbling backward out of sight, but not before Ezekiel caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Dark marks encircled Pike's neck like a rope burn, though. No rope was visible. The signs had indeed begun. Back in the slave quarters, Josiah Washington jerked awake from his own dream communion with the oak. His brother's sleeping place beside him was empty, but that didn't alarm him. Somehow he knew exactly where Ezekiel had gone and what he had learned there. The whispers that filled his ears were different from those his brother heard, but no, less compelling. The first harvest approaches, young one. Can you feel it in your bones? Can you taste it in the air? Before another week passes, the oak will drink deep overseer blood. Josiah's wounds no longer pained him. In fact, he felt stronger than he ever had in his 18 years of life, as if some vital energy were flowing up from the earth itself and into his healing body. When he flexed his hands, he could swear he saw veins of dark green pulsing beneath his skin, marking him as something no longer entirely human. Your brother will return soon. The whispers continued. When he does, you must tell him of your own vision. Tell him about the rope that dreams itself into being, about the branches that reach like hungry fingers, about the justice that comes in the darkest hour before dawn. Which one dies first? Josiah whispered to the darkness. The laughter that answered him was like wind through dead leaves, soft and rustling and full of dark promise. The one who fears us most. Fear makes the connection stronger, child. It opens the pathways through which our power can flow. Even now, Thaddeus Pike tosses in his bed, feeling phantom ropes tighten around his throat. His terror feeds us, makes us strong enough to reach beyond the boundaries of our bark and root. As if summoned by the words, Ezekiel slipped quietly through the door of the quarters. The brothers' eyes met in the darkness, and in that moment, they shared a perfect understanding. Both had been touched by the oak's ancient intelligence. Both had been marked for service in its long-awaited revenge. "Did you see?" Ezekiel whispered. "I saw," Josiah confirmed. "Pike's already feeling it, ain't he? The rope burns are starting to show on his neck. It won't be long now." They lay back down on their shared pallet, but neither expected to sleep again before dawn. The oak's whispers continued around them, through them, preparing them for the role they would soon play in a drama that had been building for nearly a century. Outside, fog swirled around the ancient tree like the breath of sleeping giants. But the oak was no longer sleeping. After decades of patient waiting, it was finally ready to collect the debt that had been owed for far too long. In the plantation house, Thaddeus Pike pressed a damp cloth to his throat and stared at his reflection in a hand mirror. The marks around his neck were definitely darker than they had been at sunset, forming a perfect circle as if a noose had been tightened there. But that was impossible. He hadn't been near any rope, hadn't even left his room since retiring for the evening. Yet the burns were real, and they were spreading. As he watched, transfixed with horror, the marks seemed to pulse with their own dark rhythm, keeping time with a heartbeat that was definitely not his own. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of creaking rope. Thaddeus Pike's screams shattered the pre-dawn stillness like glass breaking in a cathedral. The sound carried across the plantation grounds with unnatural clarity, piercing through fog so thick it seemed solid, reaching every soul within a mile of the ancient oak. But by the time the first workers stumbled from their quarters to investigate, there was only silence, and the gentle creaking of rope against bark. Ezekiel Washington was among the first to reach the punishment ground, though he already knew what they would find there. The oak had been calling to him for hours, its whispers growing more urgent as Pike's final moments approached. Now, as he pushed through the wall of fog that surrounded the tree like a living thing, he felt the oak's satisfaction wash over him, in waves of dark contentment. Pike hung from the lowest branch, the one that jutted out toward the plantation house like an accusatory finger. His feet dangled 3 feet above the blood-soaked earth, swaying gently in a breeze that touched nothing else on the plantation. The rope around his neck was unlike any hemp that had ever been woven by human hands. It appeared to be formed from the oak's own bark, twisted and braided into a noose that still pulsed with vegetable life. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Martha, cleaning woman, one of the kitchen slaves who had heard the screams. "How did he get up there? There ain't no ladder, no stool, nothing he could have stood on." Cornelius Blackthorne arrived moments later, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. He stared up at his fellow overseer's corpse with a mixture of shock and growing unease. "Cut him down," he ordered, his voice hoarse. "Cut him down right now." But when the plantation's field hands tried to approach, the tree with knives and axes, the very air around it seemed to thicken like molasses. Tools slipped from nerveless fingers. Men stumbled backward as if pushed by invisible hands, and the oak's branches rustled ominously, despite the complete absence of wind anywhere else on the grounds. "The tree won't let us near," reported Samuel, bent back, the oldest of the field workers. His dark eyes held a knowledge that made even Blackthorne uncomfortable. "Some things ain't meant to be disturbed, Master Cornelius. Some things got to play out their own way." Blackthorne drew his pistol, his hands shaking with rage and fear. "I'll blast that rope in two if I have to. No tree's going to mock me on my own plantation." He raised the weapon, but before he could fire, Pike's corpse spoke. "Too late, Cornelius." The voice was Pike's, but underneath it ran another sound, the whisper of wind through leaves, the groan of ancient wood, the collective sigh of all the souls that had ever died beneath these branches. Far too late to stop what's been set in motion. The pistol tumbled from Blackthorne's nerveless fingers as Pike's head turned with the wet sound of vertebrae popping. Dead eyes, now black as the oak sap, fixed on the surviving overseer with an expression of infinite patience. "You feel it already, don't you?" Pike's corpse continued, and his mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide for any human face. "The rope burns on your throat, the weight of the noose that hasn't been tied yet. We can wait, Cornelius. We've waited 87 years already. What's a few more days? Then Pike's head lolled forward again, and the corpse swayed silently in the fog, offering no further commentary. But the damage was done. Everyone present had heard the impossible words, had seen the dead man's eyes move and focus with malevolent intelligence. Blackthorn's hand flew to his throat, and his face went white as fresh cotton. There, barely, visible beneath his shirt collar, were the telltale marks, thin red lines that circled his neck like a brand. Superstitious nonsense, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Pike must have climbed up somehow, hanged himself out of guilt or madness. Men do strange things when their minds go. But even as he spoke, Blackthorn knew the explanation was inadequate. Pike's body showed impossible rope burns that seemed to have been made by bark rather than hemp, and his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, not the peaceful release of a suicide, but the wide-eyed horror of a man who had seen something that no living soul should witness. Moreover, the rope itself defied explanation. As the morning light grew stronger, it became clear that the noose was not separate from the tree but rather an extension of it, a branch that had somehow twisted and shaped itself into the instrument of Pike's death. Where it connected to the main limb, there was no break or joint, just a seamless transformation from wood to rope and back again. Mordecai Crane arrived as the fog began to lift, his massive frame pushing through the crowd of gathered slaves and field hands. "What in the hell happened here?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw Pike's suspended form. Jesus Christ on a cross. How did... "We don't know," Blackthorn cut him off sharply. "Pike was found this way at dawn. Must have lost his mind and done it to himself." But Crane was staring at something else. The ground beneath Pike's dangling feet. The earth there had been disturbed, not by human footprints but by something else entirely. Long furrows radiated out from the base of the tree like the tracks of enormous fingers, as if the roots themselves had erupted from the soil and dragged Pike to his fate. "Cornelius," Crane said slowly, his usual bluster replaced by something approaching awe. "Look at them marks in the dirt. Look real close." The furrows were deep, too deep to have been made by any normal root system. They were also fresh, the soil still dark and moist where it had been turned. But most disturbing of all were the objects that lay scattered in the disturbed earth, personal effects that had belonged to Pike, torn from his body as he was dragged across the ground. His pocket watch, its face cracked and hands frozen at 3:17 m. His tobacco pouch split open and its contents scattered like offerings. Most chilling of all, his boots, both of them, with the laces still tied, as if his feet had simply been pulled out of them by irresistible force. Silas Grimm materialized from the fog like a pale specter, his small dark eyes taking in the scene with unsettling calm. "Old Cherokee saying," he said conversationally as if discussing the weather, "when the earth grows hungry for justice, it will reach up and take what it's owed. Heard that from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother before her." "Shut your mouth with that heathen nonsense," Blackthorn snapped, but his hand remained pressed to his throat where the rope burns were growing more pronounced by the minute. Grimm smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Ain't nonsense if it's true, Cornelius. This oak's got a long memory and it's been keeping a careful tally. Pike's just the first payment on a debt that's been accumulating interest for nigh on a century." Augustus Fell was the last of the overseers to arrive, drawn by the commotion but reluctant to approach too closely. At 25, he was the youngest of Blackwood's supervisors, and unlike the others, he had not yet lost all traces of human decency. The sight of Pike's corpse filled him with revulsion that was only partially fear. The rest was a sick recognition that this was what their cruelty had finally spawned. "We should send for the sheriff," he said quietly. "This isn't natural. This isn't right." Blackthorn whirled on him with wild eyes. "The sheriff? And tell him what? That one of my overseers was hanged by a tree? They'll think we've all lost our minds." "Maybe we have," Fell replied, staring up at Pike's swaying form. "Maybe that's exactly what we deserve." The gathering crowd of slaves and field hands had grown to include nearly half the plantation's workforce, all drawn by the spectacle and the spreading word of supernatural vengeance. Among them, Ezekiel and Josiah Washington stood quietly, their faces carefully composed to show nothing more than the expected mixture of fear and fascination. But inside, both brothers felt the oaks, satisfaction flooding through them like warm honey. The first blow had been struck, the first payment extracted from the debt of suffering that had accumulated in this cursed ground. They could feel the tree's ancient intelligence stretching, awakening further with each passing moment, growing, stronger as it fed on the terror of those who had used its trunk as an instrument of oppression.
"One down," came the whisper, so soft that only they could hear it. "4 to go. Can you feel how others' fear feeds us? How their growing panic opens new pathways for our power to flow? The next harvest will come sooner than the first. Terror
is a more potent fertilizer than blood. Indeed, the surviving overseers were already showing signs of the oak's influence. Blackthorn's rope burns were darkening by the hour, and he kept glancing up at the tree's branches as if expecting to see a noose forming there for him. Crane's usual swagger had been replaced by nervous energy. He kept looking over his shoulder and starting at shadows. Even Grimm, with all his professed knowledge of dark things, seemed subdued by the morning's events. Only Fell appeared to be struggling with something other than pure terror. As the crowd began to disperse and the overseers made their plans for dealing with Pike's body, he lingered near the oak, staring up at its branches with an expression that might have been remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that even the Washington brothers barely heard him. "I'm sorry for all of it. The whippings, the cruelty, the way we've treated you all. If there's something listening, if there's some kind of justice at work here, I want you to know that not all of us chose this evil freely." The oak's branches rustled slightly, and for a moment, Fell's expression brightened as if he had heard some whispered response. But then Blackthorn's voice cut through the morning air, harsh and commanding. "Fell, stop talking to that damn tree and help us figure out how to get Pike down from there." The young overseer's face hardened, and whatever moment of possible redemption might have existed passed like morning mist. He turned away from the oak without another word, rejoining his fellows in their futile attempts to approach Pike's body. But the tree had heard his words, and deep in its heartwood, the chorus of preserved souls debated the meaning of his half-hearted apology. Some argued for mercy, pointing to the genuine remorse in his voice. Others insisted that participation in evil, regardless of motivation, demanded the same punishment as its enthusiastic embrace. The debate would continue for days, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The heart of vengeance that grew within the oak's hollow had been nurtured on injustice for too long to be turned aside by a few words of regret. All 5 men had watered its roots with innocent blood. All 5 would hang before the balance could be restored. As the morning wore on, and Pike's body continued to sway in its bark rope noose, strange phenomena began to manifest throughout the plantation. Tools went missing from work sheds only to be found later arranged in ritualistic patterns around the oak's base. Livestock refused to graze in any field where the tree was visible, huddling instead in the far corners of their pastures. Most disturbing of all, several slaves reported hearing singing late at night. Not human voices, but something older and wilder, like wind given voice and taught the melodies of sorrow. The Washington brothers felt these changes more acutely than anyone, their connection to the oak growing stronger with each passing hour. They could sense the tree's consciousness expanding, reaching out through root and branch to touch every corner of the plantation. What had begun as a localized haunting was becoming something far more pervasive, a fundamental shift in the spiritual landscape of Bourbon County. That evening, as the sun set red through the lingering fog, Cornelius Blackthorn finally succeeded in shooting down Pike's body. It took 6 shots to sever the bark rope, and with each bullet that struck the tree, a sound like screaming rose from the oak's trunk. When Pike's corpse finally fell to earth, it landed with a wet thud that seemed to echo far longer than physics would allow. But even with the body removed, no one dared approach close enough to examine the rope burns on Pike's neck. In the gathering darkness, they appeared to be moving, shifting and tightening, as if the noose were still there, still claiming its victim even in death. The first hanging was complete, but it was only the beginning. As night fell over Blackwood Plantation, 4 more overseers lay in their beds feeling phantom ropes tighten around their throats, knowing with growing certainty that their time was coming soon. The oak stood sentinel in the darkness, its branches reaching toward stars that seemed dimmer than usual, as if the very heavens were turning away from what was to come. But the tree felt no such cosmic disapproval. It had waited nearly a century for this harvest, and nothing in earth or sky would prevent it from collecting what was owed. The debt of blood was just beginning to be paid. The second hanging came on a Tuesday, discovered not by screams but by the unnatural silence that had fallen over the plantation's eastern fields. Mordecai Crane, who should have been overseeing the tobacco harvest, was nowhere to be found when the sun reached its zenith. The field hands stood idle among the yellowing leaves, afraid to work without supervision, but more afraid to venture near the ancient oak where shadows had begun to move, independently of their sources. Ezekiel Washington felt the oak's hunger spike as noon approached, a ravenous pull that made his teeth ache and his vision blur with visions of justice. Beside him in the tobacco rows, Josiah worked with mechanical precision, his hands moving through the familiar motions of harvesting, while his consciousness swam in the tree's dark communion. "The big one fights us still," came the whisper, threading through the rustling of tobacco leaves. "His mind is simple, his will crude but strong. It takes more effort to drag such a creature to judgment." Through their supernatural connection, the brothers could feel Crane's terror like a vibration in their bones. For 2 weeks, the massive overseer had barricaded himself in his quarters after sunset, surrounding his bed with salt circles and crude crosses whittled from ordinary wood. But the oak's influence had grown stronger with Pike's death, and no amount of folk protection could ward off what had been building for nearly a century. The scream, when it finally came, originated not from Crane's throat but from the oak itself. Sound like wood splitting under impossible pressure, magnified 100-fold and given human inflection. Every soul on the plantation heard it, felt it in their bones, and understood with primitive certainty that the second judgment had begun. Cornelius Blackthorne reached the punishment ground first, his horse lathered and wild-eyed from the frantic ride across the plantation. He had been inspecting the cotton fields when the otherworldly scream shattered the afternoon calm, and something in that sound had compelled him to race toward the oak despite every instinct screaming at him to flee in the opposite direction. What he found there defied every law of nature he had ever accepted. Mordecai Crane hung from a branch 15 feet above the ground, not the low, accessible limb that had claimed Pike, but a higher perch that no man could reach without wings. His massive frame, which had intimidated slaves and fellow overseers alike, now swayed like a grotesque pendulum in a wind that touched nothing else on earth. But it was not the height of the hanging that stole Blackthorne's breath. It was the condition of the corpse itself. Crane's pockets bulged with black oak leaves, so many that they spilled from his clothing like a dark harvest. His hands, clenched into fists even in death, were stained with what appeared to be soil, not the red clay of Kentucky, but something darker and richer, as if he had been clawing at earth that existed somewhere else entirely. Most disturbing of all were the marks on his body. Deep furrows scored his arms and legs, parallel scratches that could only have been made by something dragging him across rough ground. But the scratches glowed with faint phosphorescence, and they formed patterns that resembled root systems, intricate branching designs that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "Sweet Mother of God," Blackthorne whispered, his hand automatically moving to his own throat where the rope burns had spread overnight into an almost complete circle. "What kind of devil's work is this?" Silas Grimm emerged from the shadows beneath, the oak like a pale wraith, his small dark eyes bright with something that might have been excitement. "Not devil's work, Cornelius. Something far older and more patient than any Christian demon. This is the earth itself rising up to claim what's been denied too long." Blackthorne spun to face the enigmatic overseer, his fear transforming into rage. You know something about this, don't you? You and your grandmother's heathen stories, what have you done?" Grimm's laugh was soft and rustling like wind through dead leaves. I've done nothing but watch and wait, same as the tree. But I've been listening too, Cornelius. Listening to the whispers that come up from the roots, the stories that get told when the moon goes dark and honest folks are safe in their beds. He gestured up at Crane's suspended form with one pale hand. You want to know what I've learned? The Cherokee who planted this oak, they didn't just put a tree in the ground. They planted a seed of judgment, a living scale that would weigh the actions of all who came after. Every drop of innocent blood spilled beneath these branches has been recorded, catalogued, stored up for the day when the debt would finally come due. Blackthorn drew his pistol, the same weapon he had used to shoot down Pike's body 2 weeks earlier. I don't want to hear any more of your superstitious garbage. Help me get Crane down from there or get out of my way. But even as he spoke, Blackthorn could see that the task would be impossible. The branch from which Crane hung was not merely high. It was moving, rising slowly but perceptibly toward the crown of the tree. As he watched in fascination and horror, the corpse was being drawn upward like an offering to some hungry god. You can't stop it, Grimm said with certainty. It's already begun and it won't end until all 5 debts are paid. The tree's been patient, Cornelius, but patience has its limits. Now it's time for the harvest. Augustus Fell arrived as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, his young face pale with a fear that had aged him years in the past 2 weeks. He stared up at Crane's body, now nearly 20 feet above ground and still rising, with the expression of a man watching his own doom approach with inexorable certainty. This isn't justice, he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural stillness around the oak. This is something else, something terrible and wrong. The tree's branches rustled, and for a moment every man present could have sworn. They heard laughter, not human mirth, but the sound a forest might make if it could express amusement at the follies of mankind. Wrong? The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bark of the tree, the soil beneath their feet, the very air they breathed. Was it wrong when Cherokee children were hung from these branches for the crime of existing on their own land? Was it wrong when runaway slaves were tortured to death here as lessons to the others? Was it wrong when abolitionists were lynched for the sin of believing that all men are created equal? Fell stumbled backward, his hand pressed to his throat where rope burns had begun to appear like stigmata. I never participated in those things. I wasn't even born when... But you have participated in the system that grew from those seeds of evil. You have wielded the whip, collected the blood price, perpetuated the suffering. Intention matters little when the result is the same. Evil is evil, whether embraced enthusiastically or accepted reluctantly. The voice faded, leaving only the sound of Crane's body moving through the air as it continued its impossible ascent. By evening, it would be lost in the oak's upper canopy, another offering to whatever dark intelligence had awakened in the heartwood. Blackthorn fired his pistol at the rope holding Crane, but the bullet seemed to slow and stop in midair before reaching their target, falling harmlessly to the ground like spent raindrops. His second and third shots produced the same result, as if the very space around the hanging man had become impermeable to human weapons. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking with frustration and terror. I'll burn this damn tree to the ground. I'll salt the earth where it stands. His words were cut off as something cold and rough wrapped around his ankle. Looking down, he saw a root, thick as a man's arm and black as midnight, emerging from the soil to coil around his leg like a serpent. Similar roots were erupting throughout the punishment ground, reaching for Grimm and Fell with obvious intent. All 3 men ran then, abandoning dignity and authority in their desperate flight from the awakening oak. Behind them, the tree's laughter followed like the sound of wind through a graveyard, promising that there was nowhere on the plantation, nowhere in all of Bourbon County, where they could hide from what was coming. That night, as the Washington brothers lay in their quarters listening to the oak's satisfied whispers, the plantation descended into chaos. Livestock throughout the grounds had begun behaving erratically, breaking through fences and fleeing toward the Kentucky River as if driven by some primal terror. The plantation's dogs refused to leave their kennels, huddling together and whimpering whenever the wind carried sounds from the direction of the oak. Most disturbing of all were the reports from the other slaves. Martha, cleaning woman, swore she had seen Crane's face pressed against the window of the plantation house kitchen, his dead eyes pleading for help that would never come. Samuel Bentback reported that tools throughout the plantation had begun arranging themselves into ritualistic patterns, circles, spirals, and strange geometric designs that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. But it was young Timothy Fieldhand who brought the most chilling news. While fetching water from the well near midnight, he had seen the oak tree moving, not swaying in wind, but actually walking, its massive root system lifting partially from the earth as it repositioned itself for better access to the plantation house. "It's getting closer," Timothy whispered to the assembled slaves, his voice shaking with terror. "Every night it moves a little bit closer. Pretty soon it's going to be right up against the house itself." Ezekiel felt the truth of those words resonate through his connection to the tree. The oak was indeed moving, drawn by the concentrated fear of its remaining targets. Each night, its root system extended further, its influence spread wider, its hunger grew more focused and intense. "The third harvest approaches," came the familiar whisper, "warm as summer rain and twice as welcome. Can you feel how their terror nourishes us? How do their sleepless nights and fevered prayers make us stronger? The Pale One thinks his knowledge will protect him, but he understands only fragments of what we have become. Soon, very soon, he will learn the difference between knowing about power and experiencing it firsthand." Josiah stirred beside his brother, his own communion with the oak reaching deeper levels of integration. "Which one next?" he murmured so quietly that only Ezekiel could hear. "The one who thinks himself wise. The one who believes that understanding our nature grants him immunity from our judgment. Silas Grimm has spent his life collecting fragments of forbidden knowledge, but he has never understood that some truths are meant to be experienced rather than merely studied. In the main house, separated from the slave quarters by less than 100 yards, but feeling as isolated as if he were on another continent, Cornelius Blackthorne sat in his study with a loaded shotgun across his knees and a bottle of whiskey at his elbow. The rope burns around his neck had continued to darken and spread, forming intricate patterns that resembled both noose knots and Celtic spirals. Every hour, he checked the windows, looking out at the oak tree that dominated the landscape like a monument to his approaching doom. Each time he looked, it seemed closer, an impossibility that his rational mind rejected even as his eyes confirmed it. By his calculation, the tree had moved nearly 50 feet since Crane's death 6 days ago. At this rate, it would be pressed against the house itself within a week. The thought of those massive branches reaching through his windows, of roots erupting through his floorboards, filled him with a terror so pure it was almost religious in its intensity. In the room next door, Augustus Fell paced back and forth like a caged animal, his young mind struggling to process the supernatural events unfolding around him. Unlike Blackthorne, who sought refuge in alcohol and denial, Fell was trying to find some way to break the cycle of vengeance that had claimed 2 of his fellow overseers. He had considered fleeing the plantation entirely, but something told him that distance would provide no protection from the oak's judgment. The tree's influence seemed to be growing by the hour, spreading through the very earth itself like some spiritual contagion. Running would only delay the inevitable. His only hope, he believed, lay in somehow making amends, finding a way to offer restitution for the years of cruelty and suffering he had helped perpetuate. But how did one apologize to the dead? How did one seek forgiveness from forces that existed beyond the boundaries of human mercy? Meanwhile, in the guest room, he had claimed for his own protection, Silas Grimm sat surrounded by books and scrolls that detailed various forms of spiritual defense. Unlike his colleagues, he was not drinking or pacing or praying to a Christian God who seemed conspicuously absent from recent events. Instead, he was preparing. His grandmother's stories had taught him much about the old powers that slumbered in places of great suffering, but they had also taught him how such powers might be bargained with, appeased, or even temporarily redirected. The oak tree was indeed ancient and terrible, but it was not omnipotent. Every supernatural force had rules it must follow, boundaries that constrained its actions. The trick was discovering what those boundaries were before the noose tightened too far to escape. As midnight approached and the plantation settled into an uneasy, quiet, strange lights began to dance in the oak's branches, phosphorescent gleams like captured fireflies that pulsed in rhythm with some vast, slow heartbeat. The tree's influence was reaching its peak for the day, and somewhere in its canopy, Mordecai Crane's body continued its slow rotation, a grisly weather vane pointing always toward the next target. The third harvest was indeed approaching, and Silas Grimm's accumulated knowledge would soon be put to the ultimate test. But deep in the oak's heartwood, the chorus of preserved souls was already laughing at his preparations, knowing as they did that no human wisdom could stand against the weight of nearly a century's accumulated injustice. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and the tree's patience was finally, completely, exhausted. Like this video and tell us in the comments. What supernatural signs have you experienced in your own life? Have you ever felt the presence of something ancient and powerful seeking justice? Share your stories below. We read every comment. Augustus Fell died screaming. In broad daylight, witnessed by 17 souls who would carry the memory to their graves, the ancient oak, having moved 50 yards closer to the plantation house in the week since Crane's death, finally revealed the true extent of its awakened power. Ezekiel Washington felt the tree's hunger spike like a fever as Fell rode toward the eastern tobacco fields, his young face pale with the rope burns that had consumed his throat like ivy. Through their supernatural bond, the brothers sensed what was coming. The oak's patience had finally reached its absolute limit. Watch, children. Watch and see what justice looks like when it wears the face of nature itself. Fell was perhaps 30 yards from the oak when his horse suddenly reared, pawing at air and screaming with animal terror. The young overseer fought to control his mount, sawing at the reins as the beast spun in terrified circles. But control was an illusion. The oak had been waiting for this moment, had orchestrated it with predatory precision. The first branch that moved was thick as a man's waist, reaching out from the main trunk with fluid grace despite its massive weight. Fell saw it coming, his eyes widening with the realization that trees were not supposed to move like serpents, were not supposed to hunt like predators. He spurred his horse desperately, but more branches were already in motion, a dozen of them, then 2 dozen, all reaching toward him with fingers of living wood. The oak had become a many-armed nightmare, its canopy transformed into a web of grasping limbs that defied every law of nature. "Sweet Jesus," Fell screamed as the first branch wrapped around his waist, lifting him from his saddle with casual strength. "Help me! Somebody help me!" But help was impossible. Every witness to the spectacle stood frozen in place, watching in fascination and horror as the oak tree literally walked its branches across the ground like a massive spider. The root system beneath the earth churned and writhed, providing anchorage for movements that should have toppled any normal tree. Silas Grimm emerged from the plantation house at the first sound of screaming, his pale face brightening with something approaching scientific curiosity as he watched Fell being drawn inexorably toward the oak's trunk. In his hands he carried a leather satchel filled with items from his grandmother's collection. Salt circles, iron nails, scraps of prayers written in Cherokee syllables. "Fascinating," he murmured, apparently unmoved by his colleague's terror. "The locomotive functions are far more advanced than the historical account suggested. It's not merely bending, it's actually repositioning its entire structural matrix." Cornelius Blackthorne stumbled from the house behind him, drunk and wild-eyed, his shotgun wavering in trembling hands. The rope burns around his neck had spread into elaborate patterns that resembled both Celtic knots and hanging nooses, marking him clearly as the oak's next target. "Shoot it!" he screamed at Grimm. "For God's sake, man, shoot the damn thing!" But Grimm made no move to raise a weapon. Instead, he watched with academic detachment as Fell was drawn closer to the oak's trunk, his struggles growing weaker as more branches wrapped around his limbs like living restraints. "Bullets won't work," Grimm said calmly. "This is primal force, Cornelius. Old magic working through natural systems. The only way to stop it would be to address the fundamental imbalance that created it in the first place." Fell's screams reached a new pitch of desperation as he was pressed against the oak's bark, his face grinding into the carved initials of countless previous victims. The tree's surface seemed to soften where he touched it, becoming yielding as flesh while maintaining the appearance of wood. "I'm sorry," he cried, his words muffled against the ancient bark. "I know I was wrong. I know we all were. Please, if there's any mercy left in this cursed place." The oak's response was immediate and terrible. The bark beneath Fell's face opened like a mouth, revealing not wood but something that pulsed with organic life. The young overseer's screams were cut off abruptly as he was drawn into the tree itself, his body disappearing inch by inch into the living wood. Within moments, only his boots remained visible, then nothing at all. The oak's bark sealed itself, seamlessly, leaving no trace of Augustus Fell except for a new carving that appeared as the watchers stared. His initials, etched deep in bleeding sap like tears. "The tree's not just hanging them anymore," Blackthorn whispered, his voice cracking with terror. It's eating them." Grimm nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes in a leather journal. "Absorption rather than exhibition. Interesting evolution. The oak appears to be adapting its methods based on the psychological impact of previous executions." "Evolution?" Blackthorn spun on him with mad eyes. "This isn't some natural process, you lunatic. This is devil's work." "On the contrary," Grimm replied, his pale gaze never leaving the oak's branches as they settled back into their normal positions. "This is nature working exactly as it was designed to, balancing scales, collecting debts, ensuring that justice is served regardless of human legal systems." He opened his satchel and began arranging items in a careful circle around his feet. Salt, iron, twisted roots, and stones carved with symbols that predated written history. The question now is whether the remaining debt can be renegotiated. Blackthorn stared at him in horror. "Renegotiated? You're talking about making a deal with that thing? Every force in nature can be bargained with if you understand its fundamental needs," Grimm said, his hands moving in precise patterns as he completed his protective circle. "The oak wants justice, wants balance restored. Perhaps there are other ways to provide what it seeks." The tree's branches rustled ominously, and the voice that emerged seemed to come from every leaf at once. "There is only one form of justice that will satisfy us, Pale One. Only one payment that will balance the scales. Your knowledge is impressive but incomplete. You understand fragments while we embody the whole." Grimm's face went white as the oak's attention focused on him like the gaze of some vast predator. His protective circle, so carefully constructed, began to smoke and crack as roots erupted through the earth beneath it. "The old ways," he stammered, pulling items from his satchel with increasing desperation. "Cherokee protection rituals, blood, offerings, spiritual contracts. The Cherokee who planted us are gone, swept away by the same evil that you have perpetuated. Their protections died with them. Their contracts were nullified by genocide. We answer to older laws now. Deeper truths. You will hang, Silas Grimm. You will hang because you must, because the mathematics of justice demand it." The roots had completely destroyed his protective circle now, and new branches were beginning to move, reaching toward him with deliberate intent. Grimm broke and ran, his scholarly composure finally cracking under the weight of approaching doom. Blackthorn was left alone in the plantation yard, facing the awakened oak with nothing but a shotgun and the certainty of his own approaching death. The rope burns around his neck pulsed with each heartbeat, growing tighter with every breath. "Just me and you now," he whispered to the tree. "Just me and you and all the blood that's been spilled in your shadow." The oak's only response was the gentle swaying of branches that had tasted 3 men's deaths and hungered for 2 more. In the slave quarters, Ezekiel and Josiah Washington felt the tree's satisfaction wash over them like warm rain. 3 down, 2 to go. The harvest was accelerating, justice finally flowing like a river after decades of drought. Soon, very soon, the ancient debt would be paid in full. Subscribe now to see how this supernatural revenge concludes. Drop your theories in the comments about what happens to Grimm and Blackthorn. Will either of them find a way to escape the oak's judgment, or is their fate as sealed as those who came before them? The earth itself came alive on the night Silas Grimm died. For 3 days after Fell's absorption into the oak's trunk, Grimm had barricaded himself in the plantation house cellar, surrounded by every protective charm his grandmother's Cherokee blood had taught him. But the tree's roots had been growing, spreading, reaching through the very foundation of the house like fingers of judgment. Ezekiel Washington felt the moment when the oak's patience finally expired. The ancient consciousness that had waited nearly a century for this harvest would wait no longer. The Pale One's knowledge ends tonight. Watch, children, and see how the earth itself serves justice. The first sign was the floor of the main house, beginning to buckle and crack. Massive roots thick as tree trunks and black as midnight erupted through floorboards with explosive force. Grimm's screams echoed from the cellar as his sanctuary became his tomb, roots coiling around him like serpents made of living wood. But the oak was not content with a simple execution. As the plantation house shuddered and groaned around the growing root system, the tree itself began to move, not just its branches this time, but its entire massive form. The earth split and heaved as the oak literally uprooted itself, walking across the plantation grounds on a writhing mass of roots like some primordial God-given vegetable form. Cornelius Blackthorne watched from his study window as the impossible sight unfolded. The tree, easily 100 feet tall and centuries old, moved across the landscape with fluid grace that mocked every law of nature. Where its roots touched the ground, the very soil seemed to scream, releasing phosphorescent vapors that glowed like trapped souls. "Mother of God," he whispered, his hand pressed to the rope burns that now covered his entire throat like a collar of living fire. "What have we awakened?" The oak's approach was accompanied by supernatural storm clouds that spiraled overhead like a tornado made of shadows. Lightning struck upward from the earth to the sky, each bolt illuminating the massive tree's impossible locomotion. Thunder rolled continuously, but instead of the normal crash of atmospheric disturbance, it sounded like the voices of the dead calling for justice. Grimm's death throes lasted only minutes. The roots that had invaded the cellar didn't merely strangle him, they lifted him up through the house itself, carrying his broken body through floors and walls as if they were made of mist. By the time the oak reached the plantation house, Grimm hung from its highest branch like a pale flag of surrender, his scholarly arrogance finally silenced. 4 down, 1 to go. Blackthorne ran then, abandoning all pretense of dignity or control. But there was nowhere to run on a plantation, nowhere to hide from a tree that could walk the earth like a living nightmare. The oak's consciousness filled every shadow, touched every growing thing, turned the very landscape into an extension of its will. The final confrontation came at dawn, in the same punishment ground where the Washington brothers had endured their whipping 6 weeks earlier. The oak had returned to its original position, but it was transformed, larger, darker, its bark now gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected light like polished obsidian. Strange symbols pulsed beneath its surface, Cherokee pictographs and older markings that predated human language entirely. Blackthorne stumbled into the clearing, his shotgun forgotten, his mind shattered by weeks of supernatural terror. The rope burns around his neck had spread to cover half his face, marking him unmistakably as the tree's final offering. "Please," he whispered, falling to his knees before the oak's massive trunk. "I know what we did was wrong. I know we deserve punishment. But this isn't justice. This is something else entirely." The oak's response came not in words, but in visions. Every soul that had ever died beneath its branches, every drop of innocent blood that had fed its roots, every prayer for vengeance that had gone unanswered until now. Blackthorne experienced it all. The Cherokee children hanged for sport, the runaway slaves tortured as examples, the abolitionists lynched for their beliefs. Decades upon decades of accumulated suffering, finally demanding payment. "This is exactly what justice looks like," the oak's voice thundered through his mind. "Patient, inevitable, and perfectly balanced. You have fed us suffering for so long. Now we feed on you." The final hanging was almost gentle by comparison to what had come before. Branches descended like benedictions, lifting Blackthorn with surprising tenderness before the noose tightened around his throat. As he died, he felt something strange, not just the cessation of life, but a sense of completion, as if his death had satisfied some cosmic equation that had been unbalanced for far too long. With Blackthorn's death, the storm clouds dissipated and normal daylight returned to Bourbon County. But the oak itself was forever changed. Its transformation was complete, no longer merely a tree, but something far more ancient and terrible. The heart of vengeance within its hollow had grown to full maturity, and its influence would spread far beyond the boundaries of any single plantation. Ezekiel and Josiah Washington stood before their transformed patron, no longer fully human, themselves. The oak's power flowed through them like blood, marking them as guardians and executors of its will. They understood now that they had been chosen for something far greater than simple revenge. They were to be the seeds of a new form of justice, one that would spread wherever injustice took root. The work is far from finished, children. This plantation was only the beginning. Can you feel them? The other places where innocent blood has been spilled, the other trees that wait to be awakened. Justice has many forms, and we are now its living embodiment. Over the following decades, the oak's influence spread throughout Kentucky and beyond. During the Civil War, Union soldiers would report entire Confederate companies found hanging from trees that had no business growing in those particular places. Reconstruction officials who perpetuated injustice would disappear in the night, their bodies later discovered in the branches of ancient oaks that local folklore claimed had not existed the day before. The Washington brothers became legends whispering around slave fires and freedmen's meetings, two men who could speak to trees who carried the power of the earth itself in their hands. Some said they never aged, sustained by the oak's supernatural vitality. Others claimed they could be in multiple places at once, that they had become as much spirit as flesh. By the dawn of the 20th century, reports came from across the south of oak trees that moved in the night, that sang with the voices of the dead, that dispensed their own harsh justice to those who perpetuated racial violence. The Blackwood oak had spawned offspring, each one carrying a seed of the original's hunger for justice. And in 1957, exactly a century after the first hanging, a civil rights worker named James Byrd reported seeing two men, one young, one older, both bearing the distinctive features of the Washington brothers, standing beneath a massive oak tree in Mississippi, where 3 Klansmen had been found hanging after threatening to burn down a Negro church. The tree, Byrd noted in his journal, had not been there the previous day. Some deaths, it seemed, were eternal. Some forms of justice operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. And some trees, once awakened to their true purpose, would never sleep again. The ancient oak still stands on what was once Blackwood Plantation, now grown to impossible size and gnarled into shapes that hurt the mind to contemplate. Local authorities have long since given up trying to explain the periodic discoveries of lynchers and segregationists found hanging from its branches. The official reports always cite suicide, but the rope burns on the victims' bodies tell a different story. Marks made by bark rather than hemp, patterns that resemble root systems more than hanging knots. The Washington brothers' descendants still tend the tree, passing down the sacred duty from generation to generation. They understand that justice is not a destination but a journey, not an event but a process that must be continuously maintained. And late at night, when the moon is dark and the wind carries whispers from the past, travelers along the old Kentucky roads report hearing singing from deep within the forests. Not human voices, but something older and wilder, like the earth itself giving voice to all the injustices it has witnessed and all the vengeance it has yet to deliver. The harvest, it seems, is never truly complete. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more supernatural horror stories that blend historical injustice with cosmic revenge. Share your own local legends in the comments below. We want to hear about the cursed trees, haunted battlefields, and restless spirits in your area. Every story of supernatural justice deserves to be told. What ancient wrongs are still seeking their reckoning in your hometown?